Hey, you guys, Sarah Picaro here. Today we're getting into what emotional flooding is. You may have heard that term and may still be a little bit confused by what emotional flooding is, but think maybe it's got something to do with what you're experiencing, what you're going through, and what you're dealing with, and maybe wondering about emotional flooding, where it comes from, why does it happen, and what to do about it. So we're going to get into those questions in today's video as we dive into the understanding behind emotional flooding, specifically as it relates to emotional abuse, emotional neglect, and narcissistic abuse. So let's go. So what is emotional flooding? Emotional flooding is what happens to you. It's what happens to you mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and financially when you are deeply emotionally triggered. So it's when you get so overwhelmed with emotion that the emotions actually take over. They take over you, and you completely lose control and lose access to the logical part of your brain. So imagine your brain has two parts, right? You've got the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere, and the left side is the very logical side. The right side is the imaginative side. It's the creative side. It's when that right side, the emotions, the creativity, overrules and overpowers and takes over the logical side of your brain. That is emotional flooding. When the logical side just takes the back seat, goes out the window, is nowhere to be found. Although you want it to be, because you can make much better, much more rational decisions from that place. It's as if it's nowhere to be found and you've completely lost access to that part of your brain. So emotional flooding can look like panic attacks. It can look like elevated levels of anxiety. It can look like sobbing uncontrollably. I've had clients come to me prior to working together, letting me know that there are times where they just cry for days on end, where they cannot stop crying. It's uncontrollable. Even though they want to, they can't. It's as if the crying has taken over their life. It can look like manic pacing. You see this a lot, just pacing and racing. As your mind is racing, your body is pacing. It can look like raging and just unleashing on other people as if you are literally fighting for your very life. That is emotional flooding. Even seemingly small things can set off this emotional flood. It's as if there's a dam there and that dam has been exploded and all of the emotions that were built up behind it come flooding out. And this can happen at seemingly small, insignificant things, like these little run-of-the-mill arguments with people. It can look like something that's not a big deal, and all of a sudden, it's World War III, and you are in the driver's seat of that fighter jet. So emotional flooding is when you're in that situation where your emotions take the driver's seat and things get completely out of control. It's almost an animalistic, an animal-like feeling of not being able to step back from those feelings. If you've ever witnessed or seen a dog who perhaps was from a shelter and they're cool in most situations, but there's one thing that triggers them, and you are in the presence of that one thing that triggers a dog, right? I used to have a dog that was triggered by men with black hair and beards. She would lose it, and we knew that because of her background. It's like that. They're fine every other situation, but then they just get into that one seemingly insignificant situation, like a person coming by, and it's if it's a different person, a different animal in that case. But this happens with people too. So as we dive into emotional flooding, you may realize and think, well, do all people go through that? I mean, this seems like something that everyone goes through. And we can all attest to having emotional reactions to things. We're human, right? But there's a big difference between getting a little bit upset, annoyed, irritated, and frustrated by things, and that feeling of being so intensely, incredibly, massively overwhelmed by your feelings that you instantly shoot into that fight or flight mode when you can't even think, let alone communicate straight, logically, or clearly. And if that latter sounds familiar to you, I'm speaking to you. Because chances are, if that latter sounds familiar to you, you have experienced emotional flooding. So in its most simple terms, emotional flooding is the experience of being intensely and immensely overwhelmed when strong emotions take over. Obviously, this produces an influx of different psychological sensations, emotions, an increase of adrenaline, the stress hormones, cortisol, and result in extreme difficulty accessing your resources for calming down. And it's generally from this place that someone tells you something like, just calm down, just let it go. And you don't have the ability to access the resources that would allow you to. So oftentimes advice like that during times like this just sends you even further up that emotional ladder and scale. Because when you experience emotional flooding, when you get flooded, those emotions overtake your present moment experience and they trigger that fight, flight, freeze, fawn response in your brain and in your body. And I've got other videos about more about those, the four flight responses, the four trauma, not flight responses, the four trauma responses, one of which is flight. So flooding happens when your sympathetic nervous system dictates and detects a threat to your safety. And this always isn't just a physical threat, right? This happens when your body begins to prepare you to either head into battle or run for the hills, or you just freeze, or you step into that fourth trauma response, the fawning. You become the people pleaser, the coaxer, the everything is okay, right? And that's a very, very damaging place to find yourself in consistently as well, specifically when it's connected to a traumatic experience and you don't feel that you have any control over it. So you might experience, when you're experiencing emotional flooding, increase of heart rate, slow, shallow breathing, inability to talk, feeling like you're choking on your words, like your throat is closing up, your palms getting sweaty, your feet getting sweaty, your stomach feeling like it's twisted, wringing out, feelings of anxiety. You might experience red, flushing, rash-like symptoms. There you go. I'm even talking about it. Constriction of the throat, feeling like your mouth is getting dry, a tightness or heaviness in your chest, difficulty thinking clearly, going, wait, what was that? Like, you know what they're saying, or you know that they're saying something, but you're not able to process it because you have a difficult time thinking clearly. So there's this reciprocal relationship between the emotional brain and between our functioning, our executive functioning. Our emotional brain is actually located in the very center of our brain. And when that gets triggered, there's in between the left brain, right? There's this little spot right where the thumbs are, right, called the amygdala. And the amygdala is the emotional alarm. The emotional alarm gets fired, gets triggered, gets warned, and goes off, and then literally shuts down that part of your brain known as the prefrontal cortex, which is the most evolved part of your brain. And that's where the tools of logic, the tools of reason, and the tools of rationality reside. So all of those things are located there, and that gets shut off when that emotional fire alarm goes off. So in other words, any kind of reasonable response where when you think about it after the fact or later, you say, gosh, why didn't I just say that? Or why didn't I just do that? All those things at that time and in that moment go out the window. And then suddenly you find yourself in the deep pits and the darkness of chasing that rabbit down the hole of negative thoughts and overwhelming, extreme negative, heavy, detrimental feelings. Emotionally, this impacts you physically. And that makes it impossible for you to stay rational, for you to stay reasonable, and for you to stay grounded. So what kind of things trigger this emotional flooding? Well, it's different for everybody because we're all different. So what triggers one person may not trigger another person. So it can be very different because we're all so different. We all have different beliefs about ourselves. We all have different core rooted beliefs about ourselves, depending on our upbringing, depending on our parenting, depending on our culture, on our society, on where we live, on what we're currently experiencing. We all have different pasts and we're all experiencing different presents. So all of our triggers can be different. What's a big problem for one person isn't a problem at all for another person. But you will know that you become emotionally flooded when you sense that something is threatening. And that threat can be spiritual threat, it can be emotional, it can be mental, it can be energetic, it can be a physical threat as well. But we're talking about the emotional side of things here. And specifically when you've experienced narcissistic abuse, then that leads to CPTSD because it's complex, it's chaotic, it's continuous. All those C words trigger this emotional flooding. So you can be easily triggered. You can be triggered by the sight of a word. You can be triggered by the color of a vehicle. You can be triggered by someone's name popping up on your phone that was connected to someone that you knew in the past. You can be triggered by a message that you see as you're scrolling on social media. Triggers are different for everybody. And your body and your brain recognizes that threat as something out there, something out in the world, an interaction with someone that you knew from the past, an interaction with someone that you're presently connected with. It can even be someone that you love that triggers you unknowingly. You can feel triggered by a happy experience. Maybe you're in a new healthy relationship now and you have this thought of this won't last, or they're going to find out who I really am and they're going to leave me just like everyone else has. So you can be triggered and experience emotional flooding by good, positive things in your life now. And you're thinking, what am I supposed to do about this? Because then it seems like everything is going to trigger me. So what we experience as threatening is deeply intertwined with our past experiences, is deeply rooted in the core and root beliefs that we have about ourselves that were established in our past, generally between the ages of 0 and 7. So if you're experiencing emotional flooding and you're 30 and you're thinking, no, it's just a relationship or it's my ex, but we've been broken up for a while, I have no idea what's going on now. It's actually much more deeply rooted than you would think. So there's a lot more to it than just what this video is going to cover today, but I just want to highlight the kind of the basics of emotional flooding, why you may be experiencing it, where it may be come from, and how it may be impacting you today. Because emotional flooding most often happens when that deep core and root belief is triggered, that inner unconscious negative belief that you have about yourself from the emotionally abusive past, neglectful past, from your upbringing. So emotional flooding can happen when you think that you may be rejected. So let's say that you're thinking about going to a job interview, or you're thinking about going on a date, or you're going to a party with people who are good friends and they've been long-term, long-time friends. The mind can often experience rejection or perceived rejection as threatening. Even when you're getting ready, and say that you've gained a few extra pounds and you're getting ready to go to a party and you're putting on a dress and you ask someone that you love, do you think I look fat? And they say, of course not. Are you kidding? Why would you say that? You look gorgeous. And you're thinking they're lying to me, just like everyone else does. You experience, I'm going to get there. People are going to be staring at me and looking at me, and they're going to be thinking about how fat I am, or how ugly, or how disgusting I look, or how I've lost myself or let myself go. That perceived rejection can be the trigger alarm that goes off in your brain and be the start of emotional flooding. So even when experiences like joy, like we talked about before, are even thought of, what if I have a really good time at this party? I'm really looking forward to it. I cannot wait. Or maybe a vacation that you're going on, that can trigger an emotional flooding episode or experience that you have, because you're thinking, I'm unworthy of this. I'm undeserving of this. I need to lose weight before I can go. Maybe I should cancel. And all of these negative emotions and thoughts and beliefs come flooding into your mind and completely consume you. So a simple thought, like an assumptive thought or a past memory, or even a heated conversation and emotional sensitivity, can produce the same psychological response as an actual threat can, because the mind doesn't know the difference between real and perceived. So the body reacts the same. So when you experience emotional flooding, it can be because there was an actual trigger that reactivated an old threat or an overwhelming emotion that feels really, really heavy to hold. And your brain just kicks into going into that protection mode. And all of those responses, those trauma responses, the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, all of those are protection modes. So although we can experience emotional flooding, and we all do at different points in our lives, there are those of us, specifically those of us who've experienced narcissistic abuse or a childhood emotional neglect, and those of us who have experienced those are much more prone to emotional flooding, because we've experienced being completely shaped, changed, and programmed by those past unsafe and traumatic events, by those past abusive and neglectful past, whether it's from parents, caregivers, teachers, friends, partners. So now your brain and body is programmed to be ready to have one foot in to wait for that other shoe to drop and is ready to react to the threat in order to protect yourself. So that quickly and very easily leads to defensiveness. It leads to shutting down of yourself and projecting that shutting down on others. So keeping distance between you and people to try and create some safety, some barriers so that you don't get hurt again. It leads to stonewalling. You begin to stonewall yourself, gaslight yourself, and begin to stonewall and gaslight other people. We talk about this and completely transform your inner mind from all of this emotional flooding and from all of the symptoms and things that it causes in our Transforming Past Pain to Present Power program. So I encourage you to go check that out. The links to more information are in the description below this video. But either way, you've been shaped, you've been formed, you've been programmed by your past. And if you're experiencing emotional flooding, you have been significantly shaped by your past, and it's not leading to a healthy present or a promising looking future, because you've been taught, you've been forced, you've been punished, you've been programmed into shutting your emotions down. And that only can be effective for so long, because you shut them down, you push them down, and then they bubble up, and then you shut them down and push them down, and then they bubble up. And we go into completely healing, letting go, and truly transforming and releasing all of those pushed down, suppressed, depressed emotions that are causing you to experience emotional flooding today, again, in the program, and then even more intensely in the one-to-one work together if you're interested in that as well. So what should you do when you're in the middle of an emotional flooding episode? Well, good question, because you may think, well, Sarah, that's why I'm watching video like this, because I think that I go through this. What am I supposed to do? Well, there is some what should you do, right? There's a should word, and most people just take that advice and then end up looking like they've been in a pile of, you know what, because it doesn't work for them, because they haven't gotten to the unconscious beliefs that they have about themselves. So there's some advice. Not a big fan of advice, but there are some things that people say you should do when you're in the middle of an emotional flooding episode. So if you're looking for more tools, tips, and tricks, I've got those, an immense amount of them inside the program, but they are not standalone. They are combined with reprogramming, rewiring your unconscious mind and the unconscious thoughts, beliefs you have about yourself, which dictate your actions. They have to be paired with those, or else they're not going to be effective. So that's my word of caution as we go into what should you do when you find yourself in the middle of an emotional flooding episode. This is just advice, but it's going to be ineffective until you pair it with transforming your unconscious mind, thoughts, and beliefs that you have about yourself. Again, all found inside the program and with the one-to-one work that we do together. But the first step, obviously, is to breathe. And the second is to name the emotion or name the feeling. This is a little star asterisk right here, because it is so hard to do this when you're in the middle of an episode, again, which is why I said it's advice, it might not work, because your emotions are in the driver's seat. You are no longer driving, you're no longer in control. But the first step is to breathe. But you may find that you are already breathing, but your breathing is super short, is super shallow. Your breathing is caught, is tangled up in your throat. And the breathing is only used to project the emotions that you're feeling, the anger, the resentment, the rage. So your breathing is there, but it's not helping you calm down, right? But the first step is to breathe, because breathing activates the rest and digest part of your brain, which is the opposite of the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. So when your brain receives the message, there's no threat, right? And you're taking in deep inhales and exhales, your heart rate begins to slow down, your breathing can become deeper, and that allows blood flow to come back into your body, into the organs, and allow your body to feel a sense and state of calm. When you take deep breaths, it activates the vagus nerve in your body, in your spine. That vagus nerve travels all the way up to your brainstem, and it literally presses down the rest and digest part of your brain. So step one, take deep breaths. I say step one actually should be remove yourself from that person, that situation. That should be step one. And step two should be to breathe. So second step is naming the emotion, naming the feeling, naming something you would say to yourself. Like, okay, if you're feeling rage or anger, You might say something like, I'm really pissed right now, right? And you might go even further. I'm really pissed because, and I can feel that my heart is racing. It feels like my blood is boiling. So there are studies out there that show that naming what you're experiencing also aids in calming down the amygdala while also creating space between you and the emotion, because in that state, it's difficult to differentiate. It feels like you are the emotion, but when you name it, you actually create space between you and the emotion. So in that space, in this in between, in that middle ground, you can play the role of observer and witnessing that without it being you, without it defining you. And then in that state, in that space, and in that moment, you can also have time to decide, what am I going to do about this? So studies say that that's what you're supposed to do, but you may be hearing me say this and you may have already read those studies and feel like, Sarah, that doesn't apply to me. I cannot get to that state where I can create space. I can't name the emotion because the first thing that comes up is what's already come out. And I can't take back those words, right? I've already hurt that person that I love. When I experience emotional flooding, I take it out on the people that I love the most. And it's like toothpaste, right? You can't put the toothpaste back in once it's squeezed out. And so that just enrages me even more. But that's what studies say to do for that reason. But the power of the emotional flooding and the control and power that it has over you, your body, your heart, your mind, your brain, you may not feel that you were able to name it, or you may always go to the same name. You may always say, I'm just freaking pissed. I am just pissed. And you may always say pissed when it may actually be something else. It may actually be overwhelmed, insecure, worthless, rejected, but you just may always say, I don't know, I'm just pissed, right? So you may always find that you're calling it the same thing, pissed, when it's actually something else, something deeper, connected to something more, but you may not be able to name it in that state. So that's the next step, but it may not work for you, especially if you've experienced emotional flooding over and over and over, and it's related to much more complex things. So that is where rapid transformational therapy comes into play and massively changes and helps you reprogram, rewire your unconscious mind to remove the emotional flooding episodes. But that's what they say to do, right? But again, that may be connected to part of the problem, because for some people, emotional flooding can feel like such an everyday occurrence. It feels normal. It feels natural now, this emotional flooding thing. And you may be at a state and at a place where you feel powerless to stop it. And if you experience emotional flooding so often, you find it very difficult to just shift out of it. Those tips and tricks and the advice I just gave you, you may think, yeah, I tried that and it doesn't work. And I'm not surprised, especially if you have experienced narcissistic abuse, were raised by narcissistic parents, or good parents who are just emotionally unavailable and emotionally neglectful. So there are more options than being constantly taken over by your emotions, by being flooded by your emotions, because when you're in that state, it feels like you're drowning. It feels like you're choking on your emotions. It feels like you're literally in the ocean and there's a wave of emotions crashing over you and you're trying to get up to the surface to take a breath of air and you can't. It feels like that emotional wave is on top of you, is heavy, is crushing, is pushing you down, and you're about to drown in the wave of emotion. So again, that's exactly what we get to the very core and the very root of in my signature Transforming Past Pain to Present Power program. Again, there's more information in the links in the description below this video for that, to find out more about that and if it is a good fit for you. Because when we're that attuned to ourselves, when we're that aware of ourselves, when we're that connected with ourselves, and we have done the inner work to transform and reprogram, rewire the inner beliefs that we have about ourselves because of all those past experiences that are causing those emotions to flood us and take over, take control of us, we regain our confidence, we regain our self-worth, we regain our ability and our self-trust to move through the things that we know are going to be in our future that are going to cause an emotional reaction. And we can step into that place of daring to live more boldly, more confidently, more proudly, and in that place of living life as our real self, unafraid, unapologetic, feeling safe, and living who we were meant to be, unafraid, unashamed. I'd love to invite you again to Transforming Your Past Pain to Present Power, or booking a call and seeing if we are a good fit to work together one-to-one. using transformational healing, that just completely expedites everything. So again, I hope you enjoyed this information on emotional flooding, specifically if you come from an emotionally abusive past, a past with a narcissist, or someone who identifies with childhood emotional neglect and an upbringing are now experiencing the detrimental impact that it's having on your present and current life. I would love to work with you. So let's connect. You can find more information in the links in the description below to do so. All right, guys, that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video on emotional flooding, and I'll see you soon.